Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on the Loan Vision 200 series. Today, I am joined by Kenny Birch of Richie May and David Finley and Alex Peck of Source Advisors. They are going to cover unlocking the savings you can find with the R&D tax credits. Before we jump in, though, I do want to cover some housekeeping items. We are indeed recording today's call, and we'll be sharing it to all of the registered attendees, as well as posting it on the YouTube page, our YouTube page. When we send out the recording, we'll also be including the slides from today's presentation. Also, we do want this to be interactive, so if you guys have any questions throughout the demonstration, please send them to us. We will answer them as they come in, and you can use either the chat box or the question and answer box as well. Kenny, did you want to say a few words before we begin?
Sure, that sounds great. Thanks, Jordan. First of all, thanks to Loan Vision. We really appreciate you including Richie May as part of your webinar series and the opportunity to get in front of you guys along with Source Advisors. We're really excited for this. This is a great topic that I think really bodes well for the current environment of the mortgage industry. You know, I think we've all seen a real increase in innovation and a focus on really improving our technology and the experience of whether it be customers or employees or anything like that. So, you know, I think this is a great topic for us to cover now and one that could really be applicable to our audience. So the first thing I wanted to say is, you know, 4 or 5 years ago was the first time I saw a R&D credit claimed in the mortgage space. It was kind of a one-off thing, and then we started working with more and more providers to learn more about this credit. It's a really specialized area. And again, along with that boom in innovation that we've seen throughout the industry, it's really become applicable over the past 4 or 5 years for many more of our clients. So that number of maybe one-off credit has turned into, say, 20 or 30 clients that we see claiming this credit. I think it's a great thing and something that could really benefit a lot of people. So, you know, a couple of things about the credit itself that I wanted to touch on before we turn it over to Source and let them really get the meat of this presentation and help you guys identify where these opportunities may be is first of all, just keep in mind that it's you know, it's money you've already spent that you can put back in your pocket, right? When I think about other credits, like maybe the WOTC credit, I have to hire somebody in order to generate that credit. If I'm thinking about a cost segregation study or something like that, some sort of benefit, I have to buy a building to generate those sort of benefits. But this is money, again, in this current environment that we see, we're already spending and we can put back in the company's pocket or potentially our, you know, shareholder and partners' pockets. The credit itself from a tax perspective, the first thing I wanted to mention was, you know, this is an income tax credit generally. A lot of the credits you've probably seen in the news lately, like say the employee retention credits, the paid family sick medical leave credit, those are payroll tax credits. And while the R&D credit has that ability, it's really limited to who can claim that as a payroll tax offset. And really that's just your startups looking at companies with less than 5 million in gross receipts. So the credit itself, again, if we are claiming it as an income tax credit, there's 2 ways to claim it. You know, the first way might be to claim what's called the gross credit. And when you do that, you add back the value of the credit into income, and then you claim the full credit calculated. The second way would be what's called a 280C or reduced credit. And what they do there is they haircut that credit at the highest corporate rate. And you don't add it back into income, you just claim the credit. It makes things a lot easier from a compliance perspective, but there are some limitations on when you can claim that credit. So one thing I did want to point out as we talk about who this credit applies to is, you know, it applies to C Corps, obviously, we're paying a lot of corporate tax. It also is applicable to flow-through entities. So your partnerships and your S Corps can flow this credit through to your shareholders and partners and offset tax at that individual level. And one unique thing with the 280C credit, which is the reduced credit, when you make that election, given our current tax environment, and as a result of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that reduced the highest corporate rate to 21%, if we think about what tax rate our individuals are paying for these flow-through entities, if they're in the highest tax bracket, knowing everyone had a great 2020, and then they're eligible for the QBI deduction, they're effectively paying at 29.6%. And so if the credit is haircut at 21%, that just inherently gives you an 8.6% benefit that individuals are allowed to take advantage of, and really makes this credit even more attractive for your flow-throughs. Still attractive for your C Corps, absolutely, but that is one unique part of this credit to certainly keep in mind. Your 280C credits do have to be claimed on an originally filed return. I know that Source has worked with some of our clients and prospects that will tell them to drop in a 0 credit just to preserve that election. But there's plenty of ways around it. We're happy to talk to you about that, and I'm sure Source could as well. The last thing from a tax perspective to really talk about is just that there are also state credits available. So two that come to mind for me are the Texas franchise tax credit, and then in California, where we know, in Texas, for example, you can offset up to 50% of your franchise tax due and carry the remaining credit forward. In California, you can claim a credit to offset the franchise tax that's charged at the corporate level, as well as you can flow a credit through to your shareholder if they're operating in California. And I'll leave that to Dave and his team to talk about what navigates or what dictates what state credits might be available and when you can apply for these. But just know they are there, and there's a great benefit there for that. So, with that, I just wanted to quickly say to Dave and Alex, thank you so much for joining us. We've had Dave and Alex work with quite a few of our clients, and I'm not just saying it because they're on the presentation. I've heard nothing but phenomenal feedback from clients about Source Advisors, Dave, Alex, their whole team. They've really enjoyed working with them. They think that they are taken care of by Dave and Alex and their team, and just have really had great experience with them. So, I have all the confidence in the world that they could help any of you guys out that think there's something there. And if you do think there's something there, reach out to Dave, Alex, whoever, myself. If you're a current Richie May client, happy to talk to you, or anyone on your engagement team could talk to you. If you're not a current Richie May client, I'd love the opportunity to talk to you about what might be available there. And we could work with a company like Source Advisors to help us identify those credits. So, with that, Dave, turn it over to you and let you take it from here and really show us the meat of this presentation.
Thanks, Kenny. Appreciate that. We are so excited to talk to you guys. And I just want to briefly thank Loan Vision and Richie May for recognizing the value. And they're always on the lookout for things that are of high value to their clients. And thank you so much, guys. And I apologize. I was trying to earlier get rid of a box on the screen that shouldn't be there. Hopefully it's gone now. Anyway, let's kick things off. I'll briefly run through the agenda. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the history of the credit. There's a couple of recent developments in the last couple of tax acts that are interesting and have made the opportunity a little more exciting. Alex is going to touch on R&D tax credit qualification from a big picture, so you kind of have a frame of reference as to why things qualify. And then we're going to dig into what you're really excited about or wanting to hear, which is what in the mortgage banking world can qualify. I will touch a little bit on computations and usability, although Kenny did a great job of hitting on that, so I may skip a little bit of that. But we'll move then to benchmarking it. So really, what kind of credit dollars are possible, and what makes a good opportunity? And I think that's most of what you're interested in here. And lastly, if the presentation has triggered some light bulbs and it looks like you're interested in what would the next step be in figuring out if we have a viable opportunity, we'll cover that briefly. And if we have any time left over, I will mention an additional thing that's of interest to your community right now, which is cost segregation for some of the acquisitions and things like that. So that's it. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Alex and take it away.
Hey, everybody. So I am one of the directors at Source Advisors. My specialty over the last decade has been the R&D tax credit. and more recently, specifically inside the mortgage space, though I've worked with a wide variety of industries over the last 11 years. So I want to talk briefly about the history of the credit and kind of highlight some of the things that have changed recently. The credit itself started back in 1981 under the Reagan administration and largely didn't change for a very, very long time. Then in 2014, some changes happened specifically to software that we're going to talk about briefly later in the presentation. And then the more significant taxpayer changes were in 2016 during the Obama administration and 2017 during the Trump administration. So let's look at what those changes were on the next slide here. So the first change in the PATH Act was that the credit became permanent. Prior to this point, every 2 years, the credit needed to be reviewed and renewed by the legislative branch of our government. And every 2 years, it would always be renewed. So there was a little bit of certainty there, but with the Obama's administration, they were able to actually get this to be a permanent part of the tax code. So that removed a lot of uncertainty and really allowed for tax planning by companies that wasn't available before. The next really significant change was the startup payroll tax offset. For the entire 30 or some year history of the credit prior to this point, the folks that needed the credit the most weren't able to use it. The problem there was that you would be spending all this money starting up a business, but because you didn't generate enough revenue at the end of the year, the amount of tax you generated was nil. A lot of times these companies would be in net operating losses, so all they could do was stack carry forwards that they could maybe use at some point in the future. So generating the credit really wasn't that valuable to startups that didn't have enough tax to offset. The Obama administration actually changed this, seeing that there was a huge gap in the folks that actually needed the credit, the small guys, versus the folks that were actually getting to use the credit, which was the big guys that essentially had tax liability. So what they did was for all companies that were less than 5 years old and had less than 5 million in gross receipts, they began allowing the taxpayers to take that credit and apply it against the employer portion of their federal payroll taxes. So the way that basically works is the quarter after, immediately after you file the credit, you're able to start using it immediately against your quarterly payroll tax filings or Form 941 for those folks that are involved with payroll and all that. My heart goes out to you guys. Next was small business AMT. So previous to this, there was alternative minimum tax limitations for businesses and individuals, but during the PATH Act, they basically allowed small businesses or businesses with gross receipts that average less than $50 million to begin offsetting even alternative minimum tax, which basically skyrocketed the value of this credit, because up until this point, a lot of those small to mid-sized businesses might have been in the same situation as those startups where they could generate the credit and not be able to use it, which made it useless at the end of the day. Let's go ahead and fast forward to TCJA. And this is a more recent change with the Trump administration. Now, nothing was changed specifically with the R&D tax credit, but as you guys probably know, a lot of changes came through with regard to usability and how AMT affects different types of entities and individuals. So the first thing was, starting 2018, there's no C Corp AMT. Now, AMT wasn't a really huge issue for us as far as our clients were concerned, but starting 2018, C Corp AMT is gone. So really, the only limitation for the credit is the limitation that's found on Form 3800, which means the first $25,000 worth of tax, we could take down to zero with the R&D tax credit. then you could take down 75% of every dollar that exceeds that $25,000 amount. So what I like to say to all of the folks that I work with and speak to is that we can never take it down all the way to zero, but it's gonna be pretty significant depending on how much tax liability you have. Next is all of the thresholds for Amt change for individuals. So all of the pass-through entities saw a secondary impact of being able to utilize more credits because less of the income was subject to Amt. And then finally, the 280C election, the election that Kenny referenced earlier, that became automatically more valuable with the change in the corporate tax, maximum corporate tax rate. So up until this point, for every dollar that we generated on the R&D tax credit side, we were only able to realize a benefit of 65% because the maximum corporate rate was 35%. But with the drop to 21%, that means automatically every dollar gets a little bit more valuable. Let's move on. All right, so this is the 4-part test. And a lot of the time when people are thinking about research and development, they're kind of thinking what popular culture, media, even dictionaries and school teach us about R&D, that it's white coats in a lab with test tubes. And that's absolutely true. That type of R&D still happens in the US, despite what most people think. But it also is much broader than that. And especially when it comes to tax, when you're looking through the lens of the IRC, the type of activities that they qualify for development are much broader than what we would normally think R&D qualified activities are. In order to determine what qualifies with regard to the R&D tax credit, you need to evaluate all the projects that a company does with regard to this 4-part test. And I'm going to go over this 4-part test really briefly with you guys to kind of give you an idea of what the IRS is looking for when they say, hey, is your company conducting R&D? First is the permitted purpose. You need to be developing something new or improving something with regard to functionality, performance, reliability, or quality. And as far as I know, this is a very easy one to satisfy because the simple question is, how often do companies do things to try to make themselves less functional, less performant, less reliable, or have worse quality? Almost never, despite sometimes the end results speaking contrary to that end goal at the beginning of a project. Next is technological in nature, and this one's really important. What it says is that basically the activities within the project need to be based on one of the following areas of hard science: physical sciences, biological sciences, computer sciences, or engineering. That means that psychology, unfortunately, isn't considered one of the technological sciences. But on the flip side of that, programming a piece of software is, because it's definitely under the umbrella of computer science. And basically what we're trying to do as we're going through this 4-part test is kind of look at that roadmap and see what sort of activities qualify and what sort of activities do not qualify. The next is the elimination of uncertainty, and this is really where the rubber starts meeting the road. Basically, what the IRS wants to see at the onset of a project is some sort of technical uncertainty. And that's not a market concern, that's not a business concern, not how do we price it, what are our margins, it's, hey, is there a chance that this could fail? And is that chance based on design, method, or capability? So when we're looking at something, a really easy way to kind of determine whether there's technical uncertainty here is ask yourself the question, do I know exactly how I can get to my end result? And can I deliver that immediately without having to do any sort of guesswork, without having to test anything? So when we say something like that, a cookie cutter type situation, where let's say I'm a software company and I design and deploy an LOS. Now, if I deploy the LOS and I've made it from the ground up, the work that I've done creating that LOS bringing it from nothing to something and releasing it into the market, that would qualify with regard to the R&D credit. But if I also spent additional time reskinning it so that other people could white label it and just move around the functionality, make it look and feel different, none of that is uncertain because I've already designed that platform and created it. Now I'm just moving around things to make it look and act different, right? So there is a distinction between, hey, is this something that we could just crank out, or is this something that we actually had to work at? And the next part of this chart is where we really see how that plays out, and that's the process of experimentation. And what the IRS wants to see here is a segmented, step-by-step process where you guys are ideating, having technical discussions about, hey, what do we want to do? What direction do we want to go? What technologies do we want to leverage? Then taking it to the next level and saying, hey, let's code this out, look at our options, see what works, see what doesn't. Start doing all those other things that your company might be doing day to day, like testing new modules, testing new forms, figuring out what's broken, sending that back to the engineering team. That iterative process where people are interacting with the software, sending it through the development cycle, and testing and validating that piece of software. That's what the process of experimentation is. So really, when the IRS is looking at this 4-part test and activities that a company is doing, they're wondering, hey, are they actually taking that risk and saying, we're going to try to do something unique here, not take an out-of-the-box solution. And even if we do take an out-of-the-box solution, modify it so much that it's almost our own proprietary environment. Those are the types of risks that the government wants to see companies take inside the US domestically. Let's move on to the next slide, Dave. All right, so the next slide here, did that slide flip? There we go. Okay, so the next slide here is a 3-part test for IUS. And internal use software has always been one of those areas of contention and complexity that basically allow for the IRS to take a second look at software that's only designed to be utilized for internal purposes. Back in the mid-2010s, they made a huge change to this and basically limited the scope of what's truly considered IUS versus external software. Before, in the early 2000s and prior, when software was kind of in its infancy and being really built out to a standalone experience, being a waterfall development where companies would invest years of time building a software product and releasing it, then going into a maintenance cycle. What they decided was, hey, software has been changing for a couple of decades now. It's being more connected. Waterfall development is kind of a thing of the past. Everyone's kind of in that agile model now. So we've got to make some changes for these IUS rules and relax them a little bit. So what they did was create this IUS test to identify, hey, within internal use software, what can we qualify? First, it's stuff that's innovative. And if you look, we need to be providing a significant reduction in cost, improvement in speed, or some sort of other improvement that differentiates us that we could prove to be substantial and economically significant. The second is that we need to take significant economic risk. What does that mean? That means that we've hired developers, we've hired teams of people that are building this product that we may not know is going to succeed at the end of the day. And 3, what is the third requirement? And that's not commercially available, meaning that we can't have a commercial product out there that we can modify to use to the same effect to deliver the same level of service that we're trying to deliver. Now, when most people hear this, they're probably thinking, hey, there's a lot of stuff that we use that may be commercially available that we've modified. And that's what's, that is what's called mixed use or dual use software that has some sort of internal component, but also has an external component that either faces clients or faces other external vendors that are providing services to us. And what needs to happen in terms of analysis is to determine, hey, how much of that is internal versus external, and what is affected by that 3-part test versus that 4-part test, and what can qualify at the end of the day. Now, at the end of the day, for you guys, there's areas of qualification in both internal and external umbrellas of software. And really, that's where the expertise comes in terms of analyzing those differences and figuring out what's defensible and what is not. Let's move on to the next slide. So at the end of the day, that 4-part test, that 3-part test, really it's a project qualification, right? We're determining whether or not that project that we've conducted to build that new piece of software, to integrate that new LOS, to create the new client portal and all of the connected experiences for our client base. All of those projects that we've done, once we can qualify them, we could start looking at the actual expenses associated with them. And the 4 areas that we can look at, or the 4 pools of QREs, or qualified research expenses, are wages, supply costs, computer rental or lease costs, and contract research. Let's talk about salaries and wages first. Really at a high level, what this pool is saying is how much of your employees' time are being spent inside the umbrella of these qualified projects. So at the very jump, the low-hanging fruit, the folks that are easy to identify are going to be the developers. You know, you guys hired developers to basically do a lot of the coding that's necessary to deploy some of these platforms that we've been talking about. And let's say I'm one of your engineers. And as an engineer, 80% of my time I'm spending, or 70% of my time, I'm spending on doing development activities for new projects, or modifying currently existing platforms with regard to functionality, better performance, reliability, or overall quality. Then I would be able to take 70% of that, of my W-2 box 1 wage, and throw it into this qualified pool of expenses. Now, the remaining 30% of my time might be maintenance, and that we cannot qualify. So we're going to throw that stuff out. Now, let's say I have a team of folks, 4 other people just like me that do the same type of activity, and we could throw 70% of their wages into this bucket as well. That would be considered direct research as far as the IRS is concerned. Now, the IRS also knows that no company is just going to be made full of programmers that only do programming. Especially in an industry like mortgage, there's so many other ancillary factors that basically will change the requirements of the program that's being developed or the portal that's being developed, that requires an entire support structure of personnel that feed up to this development team. That's where direct support and direct supervision come in. So the IRS says that we could go 1 level above in terms of direct supervision and 1 level below in terms of direct support. What does that mean? Let's say that I am an engineer. I do a lot of coding, but I have an intern that we pay minimum wage to, thankfully. And this intern is really great because all this intern is doing testing on all of the code that I've developed. Now, this intern did not drive any development, did not code a single line of code, did not do anything related to ideation or conceptualization. All they did was run testing. Now, that wouldn't be necessarily strictly considered core development, but it is considered a necessary technical support activity. So I'm able to qualify that intern's time and throw it into this pool of wages. In addition to that, what we've also found on the flip side of that is that there's always times inside the software development lifecycle where there's non-technical folks driving development. C-level executives, folks that are in compliance, folks that are business analysts. These types of people are the people that are coming up with the requirements, the user stories that the development teams need in order to do what they do, work their magic, so to speak. So all of these folks, we can take a portion of their time that's spent in those technical meetings, sitting with vendors, discussing options, alternatives, figuring out exactly how we build that experience from A to Z, and turning over that wish list over to the engineers. That's qualifying activity. So all of these dollars get aggregated across all of the employees. There's going to be some that have a 0% contribution to the overall process. In terms of mortgage, that might be the folks that are at the individual branches that you guys might have, the individual agents. But then as we go up the totem pole and more toward direct research, we get closer and closer to those dollars. Next is supply costs. We usually don't see any supply costs associated with mortgage per se, but this is another pool of expenses that we can look at, and really it's only for raw materials for tangibly produced goods. So probably not going to be a big area of focus for the mortgage industry. But let's say that you guys developed a brand new tablet at your company from the ground up. All of the materials, the supplies, even the consumable materials that you guys might use in a bench setting, we would be able to qualify because of that hardware product being developed by your company. The next area that's really interesting is the bottom right quadrant here is contractor costs. And that's interesting because when we own the rights to something, but we have someone else work on it, we can actually qualify up to 65% of those costs as qualifying costs for us, as long as they charge us hourly and we own the code that they develop for us. Those are the big two factors. The other issue that usually always comes up is what happens to offshore development. And unfortunately, the credit does not reward sending jobs overseas to offshore developers. But what it does is actually encourage offshore developers to do work here. So what I mean by that is, let's say that I have a company that I want to work with that's in India, that does a lot of really great coding for very, very low dollars. If I have those folks over there come over here and work with me directly on US soil, their expenses, even though they're a foreign entity, actually turn into qualified domestic expenses because the activity happened in the US. And that's the flexibility of the R&D credit coming into play. Even for folks that work with foreign contractors, if those contractors, let's say, spend 20% of their engagement in the US, and then 80% overseas, we can look at that 20% piece and say, hey, how much of that was qualified and how much can we qualify at the end of the day for the credit? The final area of QREs is the computer rental or lease qualified research expense. And this sounds a little weird because it's a legacy holdover from the 80s when a lot of computers were super expensive and not super powerful. So what ended up happening was a lot of companies paid other companies to rent computer time as opposed to buying a computer themselves for their employees. Nowadays, this has changed completely, and it's become way more useful for companies that are in this new connected era. So one of the areas where we can actually generate qualified expenses is cloud computing costs. If you guys have, for instance, AWS or Azure or other cloud services hosting costs, and the reason why I say cloud hosting specifically and not web hosting is because it needs to be a development environment. So let's say I deployed a client portal that anyone in the world could access my services at. And in order to deploy this portal, I need to have a development environment, which is 10% of my AWS costs. And this development environment is only set up for testing and validation before I send it to the live production servers or the live staging servers. Now, this 10% is actually considered to be at risk because it's all development. So we would be able to throw it into this final QRE bucket for computer rental or leases. Now, obviously, if you guys did have a bunch of researchers or a bunch of programmers and you leased all their computers, you would also be able to throw those costs in. But we found in the real world that most companies are able to buy computers for all of their employees at this point, and really the biggest area of opportunity are those cloud computing costs. For a lot of the startups that we work with, some of these costs can get pretty big even before they have real revenue, because most of their deployment is going to be for testing or simulation. So that type of cost, because it's not a live environment where clients are accessing those services and it's not facing the world, we could include those costs. I'm going to pause here to see if there's any questions.
Yeah, Alex, it does look like we have a few questions. So our first question is actually about, I believe it was a 3-part test for IUS. Joe asks, wouldn't any process improvement in the LOS, CRM, and database processes qualify? What would be substantial?
Okay, so that's a really great question, and that's a question that we get asked a lot. So my first answer to that is it's not a simple evaluation. It is a case-by-case basis. Some of the things that we do like would be extreme modification. So let's say we're on top of, I don't know, I'll just pull a random name out of the sky, Encompass. Let's say we're on a platform called Encompass, and we've spent $200,000 worth of development bringing new functionality that did not exist on Encompass prior to my having worked on it. That would qualify as, even if 100% of that was internal use, we would still be able to qualify a good chunk of that as qualified under the internal use rules, because that functionality is something that did not exist on the platform. What would not qualify is something that also happens probably more frequently than the example that I just gave you, is reskinning or rearranging or reimagining how a user experience looks without underlying changes to any functionality. So if I was in the same hypothetical situation, I take Encompass and I think Encompass is really great. It does everything I need it to do from A to Z, and I have no blank spaces when it comes to my workflow or shortcomings when it comes to integration within my unique software environment and my technology stack. And it's just the perfect puzzle piece fit. And all I'm doing is making the UI UX or the user interface a little bit different, but not adding any core functionality to that build, then that would not qualify. Because as far as the IUS rules are concerned, it is completely commercially available, and there's nothing that differentiates it from that commercially available Encompass product. I hope that answered your question. Do we have any others, Jordan?
We do. It looks like Joe is getting ready. He's typing out a little bit more clarification for his question. But while he's doing that, let's move on to the next one. And that is, do I need to have time tracking for my employees to claim the credit?
That's a really good question. And that's probably one that I get 90% of these talks that I do. And that's the simple answer is no. To give you an idea, we have about 700 clients that we service annually for R&D, and about 5% of them have real detailed time tracking. About 10% of them have some level of detail, at least to the project, but not down to the phase and activity. The remaining 90% have no time tracking at all. And that's simply kind of a decision made by most businesses that don't need to track time because there's no billing based on time. It's just a sunk cost to them. So it's all labor. In those situations, because of multiple court case precedents that have been set, we're able to, a taxpayer is actually able to use estimates of qualifying time. All they need to do is provide a nexus between that estimate and how much dollars we're talking about. And in order to substantiate that nexus, we might not have time charges, but you will need to have some sort of documentation that shows, hey, these are the types of things that we were working on. A lot of the times for software, it's requirements documents. So it'll say, these are the requirements from our meeting on January 1st. This is the status report that we've generated. This is the JIRA that our developers are using with all the user stories and the tickets that we've completed and our workflow mapped out, and all of that type of stuff that you guys do on a day-to-day basis anyway. If you guys are running development at your company, you would be able to use that as substantiation. Do we have any clarification from Joe in terms of?
Yeah, he said, in your Encompass example, are you saying, one, the only SDK development qualifies, and two, what about laying out a new product/process, such as a new wholesale channel, construction to permanent product process, etc.?
Yeah, I would say depending on how that infrastructure is set up in your Encompass instance, that answer can change. So if you guys are having to come develop custom code and a custom workflow to add functionality to, let's say, pull in multiple data sources that aren't already integrated into your platform, then I would say absolutely we would be able to qualify that. But once again, if that stack and those connections have already been set up, we wouldn't see any technical uncertainty there, right? And a really good way to kind of look at it is, hey, how much effort did I need to put into this? Was it a simple Google look up some code or find the hook online and pay a subscription so that we could start using it? Or did my team have to develop this data connection, transform that data, go through the database architecture, set that up, and then ultimately connect those two services so that I could pull pricing information from source A, pull rate information and customer information from source, customer credit history from source B, and then marry that into some new functionality that I built on top of Encompass. I would say that level of complexity kind of gets you past that tipping point. I would love to continue answering, but I think we kind of need to speed up a little bit if we want to get to. Was there any further questions from Joe?
There was not. That was all.
Okay, perfect. Let's go ahead and move on to the next slide, Dave. All right, so I'm not going to go through all of these individually, but this is just some of the examples of qualifying activity that we've seen in our experience through our work with the mortgage industry. And this is just going to be a lot of just catchwords and really things that kind of will spark some recognition, hopefully, in a lot of you guys, just to show you guys that there's definitely activity that qualifies as far as the IRS is concerned. So let's go ahead and move on to some more specific examples. And we did kind of prepare this presentation so that when we sent out the recording and the slide deck, you guys could actually have something to reference and look at. But a lot of the things that we work with and kind of dive into is what sort of development qualifies, and it's really the type of question that the types of questions that Joe was asking earlier. Is what qualifies and what doesn't. So really what we're trying to do is kind of give you more and more examples of that. And I don't want to spend too long in the weeds here trying to kind of go through some hypotheticals. So what we did was go through some of our studies and identify some real opportunities that we looked at, and then figure out how to convey that in a really short and easy to digest way. So the first example I have is from an LOS development. And one of the functions that this legacy, that this team wanted to bring in was condition tracking and trend identification. One of their problems was that a lot of their functions, even though they were using a platform that was built out many, many years prior and that was working for the business, a lot of their stuff they were just doing manually, meaning there was agents or brokers looking through, or technicians looking through the information, flagging files individually, identifying red flags on multiple parts of the process and workflow. And they were really trying to automate that from start to finish to limit the amount of human error, to identify opportunities and stop opportunities, more importantly, stop opportunities before issues that were red flagged were resolved. So a lot of that work, even though it kind of sounds really simple, hey, how hard is it to throw up a 1 on your screen and say, hey, you have 1 outstanding note? A lot of that problem and the technical uncertainty actually arose in the performance of that. This particular client had many, many branches across many states. They were all connected. And one of the issues that they were having was some branches would be getting alerts really quickly, and others, they were not processing as fast. Now, I don't want to get into all of the details on kind of why that was happening. Some of it was hardware related, some of it was software related, but the time that they took to look at all the options, arrive at a conclusion, build it out, test it, validate those conclusions, or reject them, and then ultimately repeat that cycle until they got a usable product, that was qualifying activity. Let's move on to the next slide. Security infrastructure. This is a really huge one. So one of the things that we've seen more recently, especially with the rise of ransomware and it kind of being in the mainstream now, is automating security to a level that we've never seen before. So that's live monitoring, red flagging of traffic, intelligent identification of malicious actors and agents within the network, malicious code within the network. All of these things are things that need to be developed, and it's really unique to every single type of attack, the type of infrastructure you have. And some of the work that we've also qualified is work that went into integrating some of this stuff and making some of the hardened code changes that needed to be made in order to kind of make infrastructure more secure, not only for the client, but also for the company itself. Let's move on to the next slide. A next really common one is mobile application development. A lot of the times what we've seen, especially since mortgage as an industry has been around and kind of been a slave to a lot of the legacy products and technologies out there, is a lot of companies, even ones that have had a history, are recently now just getting into mobile application development. And that time that they're spending in developing those mobile applications could absolutely qualify too. And I know some of you guys might be in the mobile space right now. I've seen companies where their legacy desktop system and their mobile system appear to look the same, but the technology stacks are completely different, and mobile is super optimized where they're kind of married and tied down to old ancient infrastructure on the desktop side, but they've kind of made it so it looks very similar in terms of the experience. And then ultimately, another thing that all customers are looking for now is customer web portal development. And depending on how deep you guys get into that, I know there's some off-the-shelf solutions that obviously we can't just qualify customization of an existing platform like I had mentioned before. But if you guys are building that from the ground up, integrating multiple technologies and really delivering a more full service type of situation, a start to end, maybe even white labeling your platform for other lenders to use, that's a really good fact pattern for development, and one that could have qualifying dollars. Let's move on. All right, so how do we identify some of this stuff when we're not in the software world, when we don't have our developer cap on? Really, it's about seeing some of the types of job titles that we end up qualifying. Now, I mentioned to you before, there's 3 levels of qualification: direct research, supervision, and support. And this is kind of the manifestation of that. What we see is really some time being spent by that C-level group, executive management, as it's mapped out here. So depending on what type of work they're doing, that's going to increase or decrease their percentage of qualification, right? Then it's going to be middle management, a lot of directors, a lot of folks that are actually sitting in positions where they're serving as the main interface between that C-level and their development teams, folks that are leading development teams. And often we find that more of these folks have deeper experience when it comes to the actual technology stack, which is a really good fact pattern. The low-hanging fruit here, obviously, is the programming and software development group, and that's going to be all of the folks that kind of fit into that developer role, whether that's front end, back end, user interface coding, or database development. All of that stuff in between, we're going to have some levels of qualification. Then under support, I couldn't really think of that many support titles, but I do know one that comes up really often is business analyst. And one of the things that business analysts do is translate all of these requirements and processes and compliance issues that we have within that world of mortgage and finance. We need to translate that for our developers so they know what to develop, how to develop it, and how they want that software to act. Because most developers will tell you, I could build anything as long as you tell me exactly what to build. And what you find as you get into development is most people don't understand what that statement means. It means for every exception, you need to have a rule. For every single possible situation that your platform could come across, if you could tell a developer, hey, from A to Z, this is every single issue and this is how we want to address it, that developer will make a completely, absolutely kick-butt program. But most of the time, as someone that works in the space, what you find is more and more work has to be done on that front end than people realize that it takes. All right, let's move on to the next slide. All right, so this is just a really quick snapshot of the 2 different companies that are very different in fact pattern. The first one is a multi-state lender that has taken it upon themselves to really do a lot of development. And what makes that apparent is their investment in just folks that have programming and software development as their main function in the business. Those are the developers that are doing the front and back end, the database folks that are doing all of that, the software architects, everybody that you would consider in your mind someone that falls under that programming umbrella. These guys are spending over $2.1 million. Now, compared to the actual number of employees in other areas, business units of their business, obviously the headcount is not high. There's only 14 people there. But what we found is those types of employees, just on average, get paid way more than the common, broker that is just starting out. Then we have executive management, same fact pattern. What you see is lower qualification percentages because they're kind of managing other parts of the business as well and spending a fraction of their time on development. But even at that level, what we see in mortgage is executive level management salaries to be really high. And even if their qualifying amount of time might be really low, because they have very high salaries, that kind of makes up that delta. The other 2 groups at company 1 are management and support, and those are the director level folks, and then some of the support interns and stuff like that that still get paid, maybe the business analysts that don't have a super huge contribution, but also don't get paid super low dollars. So there's definitely some meat there. And what you end up seeing is that across the 39 employees that were qualifying, on average, it's about $123,000 worth of QREs for each one of those 39 employees versus the nearly 600 employees that we have across the entire company. So from this company standpoint, 40 employees of that 2,600 are generating all of the credit that they're getting on an annual basis. Next is company 2, much smaller. They develop a loan platform. And these guys are a very small team, only about 90 people. And when you look, nearly all of them are qualified. The only folks that don't qualify are the administrative personnel and folks in finance that are just, and accounting that are doing the books and stuff like that. So everybody else is a developer or programmer, or someone that's doing testing, someone that's building requirements out, someone that's ideating, and then we have a couple of executive management folks. Now, there's a lot of people, but we're still under in terms of average wages per qualified individual versus that first lender. We just can't compete with the size. But at the end of the day, we're still generating about $100,000 worth of expenses for every one of those employees that we qualified. Let's move on to the next slide. Oh, and I think this is my cue to turn it over to our resident CPA for the West Coast and Midwest, and that's Dave Finley.
In the interest of time, I'm going to be exceedingly brief about this. There's a couple of methods to compute the credit. The credit is a percentage of your current year expenditure to the extent it exceeds a base period. And these two methods, they really only differ in how do you compute that base period. And you can pick and choose between the two methods based on which one gives you a better answer. If the information exists to do the regular credit method, we'll actually compute it and compare it to the ASC or the alternative simplified method and pick the better of the two for you. But most taxpayers find that the need to go back for the regular method, to go back to the mid-80s to capture that information so you can compute it, is difficult. So most taxpayers find themselves now computing under this alternative simplified credit method, and it yields very good results. Also, the IRS likes it better because it's current information and they have more confidence in it. I'll bottom line it, in any given year, your qualified research expenditures are going to, between 5 and 8% of them are going to net out to be what you walk with in terms of credit. So if your QREs for a given year are $1 million, you're going to walk with federal net credits of about somewhere between $50,000 and $80,000. As Kenny mentioned, there are plenty of state credits out there too. I think 39 out of 50 states have them. And those can even exceed at times the federal credit. So in addition to the 50 and 80,000 I just mentioned federally, there's going to be many state opportunities as well. Some of the big ticket states, the nice ones, California, Utah's got a great credit. Sometimes Texas, Minnesota, but just know that that opportunity can significantly enhance the federal opportunity. You need to be a taxpayer to use the credit. It's not a refundable credit. So if you're in a loss in a given year, you can't use it. Good news is they carry forward for about 20 years. So if you can't use it this year, chances are good you will use it during that 20-year period. We're able to go back 3 years in most cases, sometimes longer, but generally it's a 3-year statute. So most of our engagements are looking at 2017 through 2020. We're capturing that current period and the 3 prior years. Your CPA will know what I mean when I say this. R&D credits are a general business credit. The bottom line on that is they don't reduce alternative minimum tax. So not an issue, as Alex pointed out, for C Corps. That went away in 2018. Individuals can still be subject to AMT. So it may be an issue, but they don't reduce AMT. And if you don't get to use it this year, again, they carry forward up to 20 years. Kenny mentioned the 280C election. He did a great job on that. All I will say is you want to put a protective election in the tax return so that you can, without causing any unintended AMT consequences, you want to put this protective election in. Even if you couldn't get to take the credit this year, it's too late to actually achieve it. Just have them throw a protective election in, as simple as a blank form in the return with a yes check on line 17. Zero downside, and allows you to come back to this year in the future, amend it, take a reduced credit, and avoid some unintended consequences. You guys are curious what the credit dollars can look like. I tried to put a cross section of dollars up on here for various clients. Most of these are direct lenders. The last two are some unique situations in your industry. One was a mortgage servicer that had created some creative software to service loans. And the last one is kind of akin to an Encompass type of a company that has their own LOS platform. So this is the range of benefits possible. And as Alex will tell you in a minute, the number of employees doesn't always correlate to the amount of credits. Look at lender 1 versus lender 5. Far less employees for lender 5, yet a credit that even exceeds lender 1. So it's more the concentration. He'll talk about it, but it's more the makeup of what you're doing than the sheer headcount that gets it done. I'm going to turn it back to Alex to briefly take you through how to spot a good opportunity, and take it away, Alex.
Yeah, so basically, I mean, really spotting a good opportunity and how much benefit we're looking at is going to be different for every company. Some companies are going to appreciate even a $10,000 tax credit, and others aren't going to blink at $10,000 and really going to wait until that threshold hits. I think Dave really hit it on the head when he said about 5 to 8% of all of those identified expenses, they're going to come back to you in terms of credit. So what's a good way to spot these opportunities is A, do we have internal development folks? The more internal development we have, the better the fact pattern. B, if we're outsourcing our development, is there some internal component of developers that are working in-house in conjunction to that external component? And are these guys that are working for me charging me on an hourly basis? And the last bit is, do I have the rights to the software? And this is the biggest hurdle that we have to get over, is a lot of the times people will hire an outside software developer and their agreement will say that all rights to the software are basically assigned to the company that's performing the work. And that is not a good fact pattern, and definitely one that you should look at. Another thing is, if you guys have really involved C-level executives and they get paid a lot, just benchmarking that opportunity might be a good way to see what's that minimum level of credit that we might be eligible for. Let's move on. All right, I do want to go over this. So a lot of the times when we talk to folks, we hear a lot of crazy things that are happening in the market, and I want to make sure that everybody here kind of has the ability to look at contractors that are providing these types of services and see what to look out for. Because the truth of the matter is, we're not going to be servicing every single person, and we know that a healthy competitive market is good, but just so you guys can walk into those meetings and be armed with some questions, we want to give you some provider red flags. First is contingent fees. When you see contingent fees, you should think, the first thing that should come to your mind is the IRS looks down on it. They see it as incentive for the consultant to be overly aggressive in order to maximize the amount of fees that they're getting. The second is lack of audit support. We've seen this happen a lot, where companies will get an impossibly low quote and say, hey, the only thing is, if you guys get audited, you guys will have to pay our hourly rate. The truth of the matter is, some audits end up lasting 2 to 3 years. Short ones end in 3 to 6 months. Think of how many hours can be accumulated during those 2 time periods. So when you look for a contractor, make sure audit support is included with no hourly caps. Next is, when you're in the proposal, make sure that they're asking you about those employees, asking you for wage data, asking you and having technical conversations with you as to what activities those folks are performing. Because what we've seen is a provider will go in there and say, with a 10-minute call, and say, hey, look, it sounds like you qualify. We've serviced other clients in your industry. Here's an engagement letter. We're charging you 35%. What they don't tell you is they don't know. They're rolling the dice on what your activity is, what type of software you have, and if your development even qualifies, because they know that no matter how aggressive they are, at the end of the day, they're going to be making money off of you while you are shouldering all of the risk of that study. Because if you get audited, they're not giving you your fees back. And on top of that, they may be charging you hourly to defend you. The next is a constantly changing project team. We've seen this happen a lot. Lack of experience with the project team. You definitely want someone with specific mortgage experience and more than 5 years of experience with the R&D credit, just to know that they're working in your best interest. And the last thing I really want to touch on, and something that David brought to my attention recently, is there's a lot of contractors out there selling Texas amended credits. And the problem with this is that, yes, the credit is available for amended forms, and yes, there's no problem with claiming it, but in the real world, starting from about a year ago, Texas has just not been paying any of these refund claims. And what they did was initially send out a letter saying that, hey, we're gonna put a stop on all these refunds until we review our internal processes. And then shortly thereafter got a judge to rule that they could take as long as they wanted to review those processes and wouldn't be subject to paying those claims until that review was complete. A year and a half later, we've still seen companies that haven't been paid. We've seen 1 or 2 companies that have been paid, but until we see that spigot turn on and it be more reliable, we've just been telling folks not to claim it unless they're willing to wait for years and deal with that uncertainty. And some people have. They want to stick it to Texas, and they've definitely shot from the hip and said, hey, if you're not going to charge us too much for it, we'd like to have it, and let's see what happens, because we have tons of Texas liability. David?
So, you know, if you've looked at this and light bulbs have gone off and you're wondering what would a next step be, I think we're, you know, in your head, you say that we do some of this stuff and you want to talk about it. We can figure out in short order with a 20-minute call whether or not it makes sense for us to do an estimate for you. We don't charge to do our estimates. It enables us to actually understand the scope of what we'd be taking on so we can present a fixed fee to do the work. And so we'd love to talk to you. My contact information is at the back of this presentation, which if you guys want it, they'll send it out so you have it. But we'd love to talk to you. And if after talking for 20 minutes or so, it seems like it makes sense to estimate the credit with some very simple information, largely payroll information for that 4-year span, and a subsequent call with either your CIO or your CTO, whoever knows the development activities going on with those 2 things, that payroll information and that subsequent call, we'll be able to come back at you with a good estimate of what the credit dollars should look like and what we would charge to do that work. We don't have much time. I just want to spotlight one additional possible opportunity, because some of my clients, the mortgage bank, and you guys have done so well that you're starting to acquire or build buildings to move from being a lessee to being a landlord. So I'd like to just spotlight the cost seg opportunity real briefly, if I could. If you have a building that you've bought or acquired within the last, say, 7 years, or have constructed one, if you don't do anything unusual, you're just going to depreciate that and capture your costs and write it off over 39 years, straight line. So a slow drip in terms of the reductions on that. A cost segregation will allow us to identify pieces of it, somewhere between 10 and 35% of it, that can be written off entirely in 1 year. So it's an extremely good way to whack your tax liability in 1 year. It doesn't have to be a new acquisition or a new construction. We've even gone back as far as the early 2000s, but typically 6 to 7 years is a good, dividing line. So recently done stuff. I won't walk through. This is an example. If you ask for the presentation, you'll see this is an example of a recent client of ours that spent this much on a building, 9.5 on a building, and what it meant to them. They were, or what it will mean to them. This is an estimate. And they're going to be able to write off in 1 year between close to $1 million and $1.6 million, let's say. So it's going to save them in 1 year between $370,000 and $660,000, something like that. Very cost effective to do these. This particular one is $8,500. That's a tax deduction as well. So net of the tax savings from having deducted it, the out of pocket to get this done is $5,100, which will end up saving these guys in this range between close to $400,000 per over 600,000. So very cost effective. If you want an estimate, doesn't take much. I won't go through these bullet points, but this some very basic information, and we'll get you back an estimate in short order. So please give that some thought if you have bought a building or you're looking to do so soon. And that is it. I will open it up to any questions if there are any. Anything else that anybody wants to ask?
Yeah, David, it looks like right now we've answered all of our questions. Was there anything you, Alex, or Kenny wanted to hit on before we wrap up?
No, I just say reach out to me if you would. If you want to talk about either of these opportunities, and we can figure out the next steps. So I look forward to talking with any of you who are interested in doing so. And I did again want to thank Loan Vision, Richie May, for always looking out for value-added opportunities. And thanks for having us out today.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. It was very informative webinar, and I thank you guys for sharing your knowledge and your expertise today. As we mentioned in the beginning of the call, we will be sending out the recording as well as including the slides on that. And the recording is also going to go on the Loan Vision YouTube page, so it will be open. If for some reason you misplaced that recording link, that's where you can find it. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to Source Advisors, David Finley and Alex Peck. Thank you to Richie May and Kenny Birch. Everyone, have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.